Hey, I'm Josh. I've already done a full review of the SUSVARA Unveiled, and if you're interested in that, there is a link down below. Now, this video is going to be the SUSVARA Unveiled versus everything else. Now, because we're discussing so many different headphones, it's really not possible for me to go fully in depth on every single one, but I want to give you some highlight and bullet points where this beats some headphones and where other headphones beat this, and sort of where this sits in the high-end market of headphones. And if you don't know, this is one of the highest end headphones that exist, costing a whopping $8 grand. And I know a few of you just fell out of your chairs. I don't set the price on these, of course, so don't get mad at me. I'm just the messenger here. Don't shoot me. But yeah, they're ultra expensive. And I think a valid question to ask is if this beats everything below this price tag, because that's almost every headphone on the market. And the answer to that completely depends on what you want. All right, I know you have questions. One, when are you shaving your head? Why isn't the microphone plugged in? And what is the sponsor of today's video? It's headphones.com. Any of the headphones we talk about can be found down in the description down below. If you do want to check out any of them, I would highly recommend headphones.com. They have an awesome return policy, payment options if you choose to use those, excellent customer service if you need some help. They have some qualified people working there to help you find the best headphones suited for you. Headphones.com really does allow for a lot of the content on this channel to be possible, and there's a lot of stuff that I would not be able to make without them. And that's not an exaggeration either. So if you appreciate the channel, I would appreciate it if you would give them a try. If you do decide to buy a headphone that they sell, check them out down below. Thanks a lot. So let's start with HiFiMAN's own lineup. There are a number of other unveiled headphones that have come out recently that I think are quite a bit different than this, and in some cases better, in some cases worse. Let's take the HE1K Unveiled. This thing is a bit brighter than that of the SUSVARA, and with that you get a better access to what I consider to be details. Now, whether or not the driver is actually more detailed or actually faster, I'm not 100% sure. But because those high-end frequencies are pushed forward a little bit further than that of the SUSVARA, it does come across more detailed. Now, whether or not this is just a trick of frequency response or not, it's hard to say, and I'm not even sure it really matters. Whatever headphone seems to be the most detailed often is perceived as the most detailed. And in my opinion, HE1000 is better detail, but it is brighter, and that makes the SUSVARA a little bit more toned down and more subtle in the treble response. And that is just an area of personal preference, but I could completely see an argument for the HE1000 being not as good technically also as the SUSVARA being a little bit more targeted here. And I would consider the SUSVARA to be a bit more pleasing to listen to overall for vocals, but one of the compromises to that in this comparison is that the SUSVARA bass isn't actually as impressive. The last area where I think the 1000 beats the SUSVARA is sound staging most of the time. As I discussed in the full review, the SUSVARA has this weird ability with very specific tracks to like be the best sound staging headphone that exists. It's weird. Like, you will play a certain track and like the headphone will almost disappear. But on a lot of other tracks, maybe even most, you don't get that same effect. It's like very few that this comes across like it. When you're listening to a very different headphone like an HD800S, those sound staging characteristics get way pushed out. Like, it doesn't matter what the song is calling for, every song sounds wide. This is not the case with either of these headphones, but definitely not the case with this SUSVARA. It very much does what the song is calling for it to do. Now, to bring this back to the comparison to the HE1000, the HE1000 has a better ability to soundstage for most music, but occasionally the SUSVARA does beat it, but I would give the overall edge to the 1000. Now, versus the Aria Unveiled, the Aria has better mid-range than both of these, actually, the 1000 or the SUSVARA. But versus the SUSVARA, I don't feel like the tuning is nearly as good as an overall picture. I feel like the mid-range is like kind of a sweet spot for it. But when it comes to sound staging, bass potential, timbre potential too, I feel like the SUSVARA pulls ahead in all categories. So to me, this is an overall win for the SUSVARA, but the price difference is like 7 times that of the Aria. So the edge definitely goes to Aria for value, but in total sound quality, I feel like the SUSVARA is better. Now, versus the OG SUSVARA, I like this a lot more than the OG SUSVARA. I would not have considered that to be really worth it in my just personal opinion. And I don't really think that the price is justifiable on this headphone either. But if you were to just ask me whether or not I like one of them, I didn't really love the OG. And I like this a lot more, but it does come with compromises. And there are some other reviews on YouTube that go much more in depth and have like a better A/B comparison than I can personally give. So outside of HiFiMAN, what are some other brands, some other companies, and some other headphones that really stand out as being good competitors to this? Let's talk about one of my favorite headphones, the Meze Empyrean 2. I think that this is more comparable to the Meze Elite personally, because they're both a little bit more neutral than that of the Empyrean 2 and therefore more combative in that neutrality space. But when it comes to comparisons I can actually do here, there's a similar story with a lot of other high-end headphones here. I think that the bass response in the Empyrean 2 is stronger and better. There is an argument to say it's not as clean as the SUSVARA, but that quantity is just far more enjoyable for day-to-day use and for general music on the Empyrean. It just wins for bass, in my opinion. Maybe there's an argument for quality being an edge on the SUSVARA, but in terms of listening enjoyment, Empyrean wins all day. When it comes to something like timbre, I actually feel like the SUSVARA is ahead in timbre by quite a bit, especially as it gets towards the upper frequencies. The upper frequencies on the Empyrean do sound a little bit plasticky compared to the much more, I would say, honest reproduction of the SUSVARA. Now, that honesty is not always super pleasing on the SUSVARA because you're going to get whatever the music is really trying to tell you it's doing, and whatever it's displayed as is how it's going to represent on this headphone. The Empyrean 2 will lie to you and kind of display a song is really, really good, even though on a more neutral headphone or a more honest or more correct or more target adherent headphone, it may not be as good. And that edge for listening enjoyment goes to the Empyrean. The edge for honesty goes to the SUSVARA. Depends on personal preference here, especially for treble, but I would say that the overall edge goes to the SUSVARA being less peaky and also a bit more timbre correct. When it comes to sound staging, this is tough. The Empyrean 2 has a bit more of a blob soundstage kind of to the right and the left. It's got good overall coverage, don't get me wrong, but in this comparison here, you do notice more of right and left soundstaging more than forward and back depth and height and stuff like that. Those are things that the SUSVARA is better at. Better depth, better height, better scale to certain songs. It does depend a little bit song to song on what kind of sounds best for soundstaging. Just depends on how it was mixed, if it is supposed to sound better on the sides, or if it's supposed to have more scale. But I will say the same thing I said with the HE1K. On certain songs, the SUSVARA can like almost disappear. It's really wild how well it can do it with very specific songs. The Empyrean 2, the soundstaging is always good. It always has this sense of scale and size to it, but I never quite get it to disappear to the same level that the SUSVARA will. So these end up having very different soundstaging abilities. Both are very good, but in their own categories. When it comes to mid-range, this is a toss-up of personal preference. I think the Empyrean 2 is a little bit more shouty, but both lead in that slightly shouty direction already. So they both actually have somewhat equivalent vocals, in my opinion. I do think that the vocals maybe stand out more isolated from the background instruments on the Empyrean, but it really just depends on the song. There are some songs that vocals have never sounded better on than on the SUSVARA, and there are some songs that have never sounded better than on the Empyrean. Now, HD800S with, let's say, a Mogwai amp, that will give you a bit closer of a price comparison, and is also one of the better versions of the HD800S that you will hear. I think the dynamics and the excitement factor go to the 800S. You also get the benefits of sound staging, and because of the Mogwai, you get something like a warmer sounding, deeper sounding mid-range than you otherwise would from just like a regular solid state, for example. Now, that being said, I think treble here is still going to be a very polarizing comparison. On one hand, the 800S is a little bit more peaky and a little bit more sparkly. Some people are going to like that kind of vibrant transients in the top end, but a completely different audience will prefer the more subtle, easier to listen to, easier on the ears version of the SUSVARA. Now, which actually comes across more detailed depends on what you're listening for. If you're listening for like room information stuff in the environment, you'll get more out of that out of the HD800S. If you're listening more towards things like vocal timbre and texture, you'll get more of that out of the SUSVARA. The SUSVARA also sounds a lot more narrow than that of the 800S. That mid-range section in your head, it fills out significantly better than even the best versions of the 800S. And even with amplifiers that are really good at enhancing the bass capability of 800S, like the Niche Pietus Maximus, like the Mogwai, like that Felix Euphoria Evo back there, the SUSVARA's bass is just better than it. It's flatter, it hits harder, it's got planar speed, and it doesn't have the distortion characteristics and the lack of sub bass that the HD800S has. The overall better headphone, in my opinion, is the SUSVARA, but again, price differential is hard to justify. Okay, now when it comes to Diana DZ, these are actually fairly close in some capacities. One is the fitment of them is fairly similar. They're both very slim planars. They're both on the lighter end of planars, and they both have a suspension strap and pads that will slightly touch your ears. And some people Really hate that. And there are even some comparators past this point, like the bass response on both is not super strong and is beaten out in terms of quantity by headphones like Empyrean 2. So they're both about equivalent for bass in my opinion. The slight edge might go to the DZ with specific pads, but I guess if you threw specific pads on the SUSVARA, it might have better bass too. So it's up in the air in terms of bass. When it comes to mid-range, these are very different, totally up to personal preference. Both lean on the cleaner side of mid-range though. They both sound extremely fast. They both sound very detailed, very personal. And neither is really what I would consider like a super warm vocal experience. And so you're not really going to be getting that with either of these headphones. When it comes to treble response, in terms of frequencies, I think it's a bit of a toss-up of which one's better. They both have really good coverage. They both can add a lot of sound staging. And for treble, they can both sound excellent on specific tracks. When it comes to sound staging potential though, the SUSVARA is better. I really do think that there's something to large physical drivers that makes for better sound staging, especially when it comes to scale. And that's why headphones like the HE1000 and the Aria scale so well and sound so huge, when headphones like the Diana kind of doesn't, unfortunately. It's not to say that Diana's sound staging is not good, but I do feel like the potential of the SUSVARA is better. However, an area that is undeniably better on the Diana is just raw speed. The detail capability of the Diana is much greater than that of the SUSVARA in almost every category. It's just undeniably faster sounding in almost every region, and so details go to the DZ in my opinion. Versus a headphone like the Audeze LCD5. Unfortunately, I didn't really like the LCD5 all that much as a headphone, and I thought that it had some decent characteristics like its neutrality, but in general, I find this to be a better headphone in every single category. Bass response, mid-range capability, treble detail, treble forwardness, treble timbre, dynamic range, sound staging, every category of the headphone, including the comfort, including the build quality, I find to just be a bit better on SUSVARA. I'm just gonna label that as a W for the SUSVARA. When it comes to some obscure options, you have some offerings from Stax, which in general I find to be less good in the bass response, better in the sound staging department, but more fatiguing in the treble. And mid-range is going to be up to that particular Stax headphone. They have quite a few that I think follow this kind of formula of being brighter in the treble response and less dynamic in the bass. And overall, I think this is fairly representative of the electrostatic versus planar argument. But if you're chasing some other things like tonality, texture, bass, dynamics, those sorts of things, I think planars in general, but specifically this planar would be better. One comparison that I wish I could do, but I haven't heard it yet, is the Utopia 2 versus this. And I am slated to be reviewing that eventually, but it hasn't yet arrived, so unfortunately I can't answer that. Like I said, you can find links to any headphone that we talked about today down in the description below. And I do want to send a massive thank you again to our sponsor, headphones.com. They really do help the channel quite a lot. Thank you so much. So hopefully I could answer some questions that you might have for this SUSVARA versus some other headphones. It's a very good headphone on its own. I think the price makes people think about the price more than the sound quality necessarily, because they're always questioning whether or not it's worth it for that price, rather than just questioning if it's good. And I do think it's good. And I think it keeps up with a lot of other headphones, but being like double the cost of most companies like flagship price does make it hard to justify. Also at the same time, if you're legitimately considering buying this, you may not even be concerned about price in the first place. So hopefully that provided some insight. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.